Imagine waking up every day knowing that 830,000 barrels of oil are being transported just for you, fueling your commute, heating your home, and powering industries. Now, what if that same pipeline could also raise gas prices, create environmental disasters, and spark a trade war? This is the Keystone Fidel Pipeline, a project that could change the way we think about energy, but not without controversy. Back in 2008, a Canadian company called TC Energy, formerly TransCanada, proposed the Keystone 40L pipeline, which would bring crude oil straight from Canada's oil sands in Alberta to U.S. refineries along the Gulf Coast. The idea was simple: 830,000 barrels per day. That's a lot of oil to fuel our cars, power plants, and industries. But like anything this big, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. While some see it as a golden opportunity to lower fuel costs and make the U.S. more energy independent, others worry about massive oil spills, higher emissions, and the impact on local communities. Over the years, this pipeline has sparked a heated debate. Could it help stabilize gas prices and bring more jobs? Or is it a ticking time bomb for the environment and public health? Stick with me as we break down how the Keystone 40L pipeline could impact your life, whether you're filling up your car, paying your heating bills, or just trying to breathe clean air. To understand why Trump's offer is such a game changer, we need to start by understanding the history of the Keystone 40L pipeline. Originally proposed in 2008 by Canadian company TC Energy, formerly TransCanada, the pipeline was designed to transport oil from Canada's oil sands in Alberta to refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast, delivering 830,000 barrels per day of crude oil. At its peak, the project was expected to generate up to 42,000 jobs, according to TC Energy. Construction would create thousands of jobs, while the operation of the pipeline would create around 50 permanent jobs in each of the two countries. The economic boost was a major selling point for both the U.S. and Canadian governments. However, environmentalists, local communities, and indigenous groups raised concerns over its environmental impact, particularly the risks of oil spills, water contamination, and damage to critical ecosystems. In 2015, under President Obama, the U.S. government rejected the permit for the northern leg of the pipeline. But after Trump took office in 2017, the project was revived with a new permit to build, which caused a stir in both the U.S. and Canada. In 2021, President Biden canceled the permit once again, citing climate change concerns and international commitments to reducing carbon emissions. Yet, the debate surrounding the pipeline never really ended, and now, Trump's proposal to revive it has reopened old wounds. Trump has always been a staunch advocate of domestic energy production. During his presidency, he rolled back many environmental regulations to push for increased oil and gas production in the U.S. His administration approved major pipelines like the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone 40L. But now, in 2023, he's calling for the revival of this particular project. Trump's pitch is simple: revive the pipeline and guarantee easy regulatory approvals for the project. His promise to streamline the permit process, which has been bogged down for years, would allow the project to get back on track faster. He believes that increasing oil imports from Canada could reduce the U.S. dependency on overseas oil, particularly from unstable regions like the Middle East. But it's not all smooth sailing. The Canadian government has expressed concerns about tariffs and trade negotiations. Trump has previously imposed tariffs of up to 25% on steel and aluminum imports from Canada, which also directly impacted the cost of building pipelines. From an economic standpoint, reviving Keystone 40L would also have a direct impact on U.S. oil prices. Canada's oil exports make up 61% of U.S. crude imports as of 2022, and importing more oil from Canada could stabilize prices. As of August 2023, the price of WTI crude oil was hovering around $85 per barrel, and a significant increase in supply could help reduce future price volatility. Let's consider the everyday impact. If this pipeline were revived, one of the immediate consequences could be a drop in fuel prices for Americans. For example, gas prices in the U.S. have fluctuated from around $3.5 per gallon in early 2023 to $4 in the summer. More oil supply could mean more competition in the market, potentially lowering gasoline costs by 10% or more in some states. Canada is one of the largest oil producers in the world, with vast reserves of oil sands in Alberta. As of 2023, Canada produced 5.3 million barrels per day of oil, with 3.7 million barrels per day of that coming from the oil sands. The United States, as Canada's primary trading partner, imports a significant portion of its oil from Canada. In fact, Canada supplies over 60% of the U.S.'s total oil imports, and the Keystone 40 oil pipeline was projected to add another 830,000 barrels per day. If the pipeline were revived, Canada could see significant economic gains. In 2021, the Canadian energy sector contributed $153 billion to the national GDP, and Keystone 40 could contribute an additional $2.4 billion in annual revenue, especially during the construction phase. Canada's oil sands industry supports over 150,000 jobs in Canada, and the pipeline would provide a direct path for boosting employment numbers and expanding energy exports to the U.S. However, it's not all rosy. While the U.S. may benefit from a reliable oil supply, the situation is more complicated for Canada. If relations sour, for example, due to ongoing trade disputes, Canada could face higher tariffs on oil exports, which would drive up costs for consumers and businesses. For the average Canadian, that could mean higher prices at the pump. As of August 2023, gasoline prices in Canada averaged $1.6 per liter, and if tariffs or trade conflicts escalate, Canadians could see a 5 to 10% increase in fuel costs. One of the biggest issues surrounding the Keystone 40 pipeline is its environmental impact. Environmentalists argue that the pipeline would carry oil sands crude, which has a much higher carbon footprint than conventional oil. The extraction process for oil sands produces 3 times more greenhouse gases than traditional crude oil extraction. In fact, oil sands production in Alberta is responsible for 8% of Canada's total carbon emissions, and the project could add as much as 18.7 million metric tons of COTWO into the atmosphere annually. According to a 2021 report by the Environmental Defense Fund, if the pipeline is revived and operational, it would emit over 935 million metric tons of COTWO per year over its 50-year lifespan, which is the equivalent of 18.7 million cars on the road. The potential for oil spills is another major concern. A 2018 study found that pipelines carrying tar sands oil have spilled 3 times more than those carrying conventional crude. From 2010 to 2020, the Trans-Canada pipeline system saw more than 30 spills. If a spill occurred near critical water sources, such as Nebraska's Ogallala Aquifer, it could affect 2 million people who depend on this water for drinking and irrigation. From an everyday perspective, the environmental concerns could have long-lasting effects on health and agriculture. If a significant spill were to contaminate water supplies, communities could face higher healthcare costs and reduced agricultural output due to polluted irrigation systems. Additionally, the ongoing climate crisis could lead to more severe weather patterns, impacting the way people live, work, and prepare for natural disasters. Reviving the Keystone 40 pipeline could have significant economic and political consequences for both Canada and the United States. On the economic front, the project would create 11,000 direct jobs during construction and an additional 60,000 indirect jobs across the U.S. and Canada, according to the U.S. State Department. Canada's oil industry could see a major boost in revenue as the pipeline would allow more oil to be exported to the U.S., helping fill the $3.5 billion trade deficit Canada has with its southern neighbor. However, there are trade-offs. Canada is already facing uncertainty with tariffs imposed by Trump. If these tariffs were implemented, they could lead to higher prices for goods and services in Canada, as well as strained relations with the U.S. This could also hurt Canadian businesses that rely on trade with the U.S., which accounts for nearly 75% of Canada's exports. On the U.S. side, there's a clear political divide. Some politicians argue that reviving the pipeline is crucial for energy security and job creation, especially in states like Montana and South Dakota, where the pipeline would pass through. On the flip side, environmentalists and progressive politicians view the project as a step backward in efforts to combat climate change. The impact on everyday life. If the pipeline moves forward, we may see lower gas prices and increased energy jobs. However, local communities and indigenous groups near the pipeline's route could see long-term environmental harm affecting their health and livelihoods. On both sides of the border, we will see shifts in trade dynamics, potentially raising the cost of living for some. The future of the Keystone 40L pipeline remains uncertain, while the potential benefits of creating jobs, lowering energy costs, and enhancing energy security are significant. The environmental and social risks remain substantial. This is a debate that will not only impact the energy industry, but also affect our daily lives, from the gas we put in our cars to the air we breathe. As President Trump pushes for its revival, Canadians and Americans alike must weigh the costs and benefits carefully. In the end, the decision will determine not just the fate of a pipeline, but the future of energy policy, environmental protection, and global climate change efforts for decades to come.
Which hits your budget if you're paying off a car or a home. Additionally, inflation could rise as global trade moves away from the dollar. For instance, goods you buy from overseas like electronics, clothing, or even food could see price hikes. These changes, while on the surface seem far removed, could ultimately affect your cost of living and purchasing power. Chapter 4. The impact on the U.S. economy, higher borrowing costs, and more volatility. So what does this mean for the U.S. economy? Well, if these countries continue pulling back from U.S. Treasury bonds, it could have some serious consequences for the U.S. First, there's the possibility of higher borrowing costs. The U.S. government relies on foreign investors to buy its debt. If these investors back off, it could lead to higher interest rates on U.S. Treasury bonds. When demand for U.S. debt falls, bond prices drop and yields rise. This means the U.S. government has to offer more attractive rates to borrow money, which could increase the U.S. national debt even more. In fact, a 1% rise in long-term interest rates could add an estimated $30 billion to the U.S. government's interest payments each year. For consumers, that could mean higher mortgage rates, which could increase monthly payments by $400 for the average American homebuyer. For businesses, the cost of financing could become more expensive, slowing economic growth and potentially even leading to a recession. This higher cost of borrowing isn't just bad news for the government, it affects everyone. If the U.S. government is spending more on debt, that's less money available for programs like healthcare, education, or infrastructure. It could also lead to less investment in research and development, making it harder for the U.S. to compete in the global economy. Chapter 5. The future of the U.S. dollar, a global financial revolution. This brings us to the most crucial question. What's next for the U.S. dollar? Can it continue to hold its position as the world's reserve currency? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a financial revolution? One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the increasing role of alternative financial systems. As countries move away from the US dollar, they're creating new financial networks to bypass the US-led system. For instance, Russia launched its own payment system, SPFS, which allows countries to make transactions without relying on the US-dominated SWIFT network. And countries like India are increasingly using their local currencies for trade. India even struck a deal with Sri Lanka to settle payments in rupees rather than dollars. Gold is also making a big comeback. As we mentioned earlier, central banks bought a record amount of gold in 2024, and this trend shows no signs of slowing down. As the US dollar faces more competition, gold is being seen as a safer alternative, which could increase its value significantly in the coming years. In fact, gold prices rose 40% in 2024 alone, as investors flocked to it as a hedge against currency devaluation. Finally, there's the rise of digital currencies. Countries like China are already experimenting with central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. The digital yuan is already being used in over $2 billion in cross-border transactions, challenging the dominance of the US dollar in international trade. If more countries adopt their own digital currencies, it could significantly reduce the reliance on the US dollar. The future of the US dollar is uncertain. While it still holds the title of the world's reserve currency, we're seeing a slow but steady shift towards financial diversification. Countries like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and even Canada are reducing their exposure to US debt, and in doing so, they're shifting the global financial landscape. This shift is not just about reducing risk, it's also about reclaiming financial independence. Countries are looking for alternatives to the US dollar, and as they do, we might see the rise of new financial systems and new global players. The US could face higher borrowing costs, slower economic growth, and more volatility as its dominance starts to wane. What do you think? Are we seeing the decline of the US dollar? Or is this just a passing trend? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.